Good morning. Today is 13 December, the year 2013. I'm Dr. Dave Thompson, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in Palm Springs, California. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who participated in our country's military conflicts. Today, I'm here along with fellow volunteer Bob Lilac, and today we have the honor and the privilege of interviewing Captain Tony Sultan. Captain Sultan was an F-4 pilot in Vietnam during that conflict, and so we're going to talk to him about that and a lot of other things. Tony, so good to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Okay.
One thing the Air Force did that I really respected was everybody was going to fly, unless you volunteered for another tour, everybody was going to fly one tour before somebody was basically forced to fly two.
You say one
in
tour,
Vietnam.
a combat tour.
Yeah, combat tour, whether it was 100 missions north or a year with less than 100 missions.
Okay, so in what year would that have been that you went to George? 1960?
67.
Okay, and you went to George Air Force Base in California,
Yes.
up at Victorville, and we're transitioning to the front seat. How long was that program, and what do you remember anything about it?
Well, I remember that one of our guys that was upgrading got killed. He flew into the ground. His backseater got out. They got into a spin, I guess, not flew into the ground. They got into a spin. The backseater got out, but the front seater didn't. That's a recollection. The other was the excitement and the fun of moving from the back seat to the front seat and being the aircraft commander and being responsible for not only the aircraft but the fellow in the back seat, who, by the way, was also a GIB at that point. They hadn't changed to radar operators. They were more interested in us as backseaters. Could we be upgraded? And what would it take to make us safe and come back?
Okay, so you are upgrading to the front seat, and you were assigned a relatively new pilot for the back seat,
Right.
a guy in the back seat,
Right.
a pilot in the back seat.
Exactly. And that young fella was from New Jersey. His name was Dan Galante. Came with me to Vietnam and flew in my back seat in Southeast Asia.
Okay, so you flew at George for about how long? Do you
I'm
recall?
going to say 6 months.
6
Or
months?
4 months, whatever. I don't.
Okay.
I
And then from George, you and your new backseat pilot were
went
assigned to where?
Cam Bay
Cam Bay, which is where?
in central South Vietnam on the coast. But before we did that, got to Cam Bay, we were afforded the wonderful opportunity of going through jungle survival in the Philippines.
You want to tell me a little bit about that jungle survival school in the
Well,
Philippines?
that actually was a fun experience, as Stead wasn't, but the Philippine experience was fun. We our instructors were Negrito, which were natives from the Philippines who had, as I recall, been great volunteers in saving Americans during the Second World War. And the American government kind of took care of these people. They took us out in the jungle after some classes and taught us how to cut down vines and get water from vines, and how to put your parachute between two trees to get you off the ground so that the snakes wouldn't get you, and the wild boars and all the other animals that were running around the jungle. So that if you had to bail out, and you learned what punji steaks were, and you learned about all of the ugly things that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were doing to America.
What's a punji steak?
That's a steak that has got feces on it that's stuck in the ground in a pit, that if you walk over it, you fall into this pit, get stabbed by these punji steaks, and now you're infected with some of the nastiest bacteria that you can imagine.
So jungle survival school taught you about how to survive in the jungle, and then you went from the Philippines. How long was that program, roughly?
In the Philippines?
Yes.
Oh, a couple weeks. At the
Couple
most.
weeks?
Yeah.
Then you went to Cam Ranh Bay.
Yes.
Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. Well, tell us a little bit about that. What was the squadron you were in, and
I was in the 559th Tactical Fighter Squadron. Had a great squadron commander named Ross Carson. And we had a ops officer, and I wish I could remember the name. I shouldn't speak ill of him because he was shot down and captured in Korea, shot down and captured in Vietnam, and he was the lieutenant colonel that wanted to prosecute some of the guys for talking in the Hilton.
understand?
And he was Ted Guy was his name. It just came to mind. He was. I guess that's enough. He had some really tough experiences.
So he was a POW in North Vietnam for quite a few years?
Yes,
But he came back?
yes.
He did come back.
And then wanted to prosecute those guys for whatever. But
Well-
my experience in Vietnam was I was in the 559th. Your first early missions, you fly in the back seat. There's an opportunity to take a guy out and show him combat as opposed to some of the single seat fighters where you didn't have that same opportunity. We went on a few missions that way, and then we flew wing for quite a while until we could demonstrate that we could lead flights.
What do you mean by flying wing?
Aircraft that are on combat sorties either went out in twos or fours. So you would be either 2, 3, or 4 as opposed to the lead aircraft that was the had command of the flight.
And those missions that you went out, what kind of ordnance were you typically carrying, and what was your mission?
Well, the missions we flew in South Vietnam were for me the most rewarding because for the most part they were troop support. Army Marines that were in trouble, and you were called in by the forward air controller who flew a small aircraft with white phosphorus rockets on it. They would fire these rockets and tell you from that mark on the ground, this white smoke, where they wanted you to deliver the ordnance. And those guys, boy, you got to give them a lot more credit than you can give anybody else because here they are flying around in Piper Cubs being shot at by everything imaginable, marking targets for the fast fighters to come in and drop all this ordnance, which ranged from, as I said earlier, 750-pound bombs to napalm rockets, smaller bombs, the Gatling gun, and on some occasions we carried 1,000-pounder centerline with fuse extenders on them, which we dropped in the forest to prepare landing zones for the helicopters. Now this is a 6-foot fuse on the front of a 1,000-pound bomb, which would shear the trees off. Trees would fall, and right in behind these bombs would come the helicopters. It was really something to see.
So you were in the construction business, making landing zones for helicopters as
That's
part of your
right.
mission, huh?
That's exactly
That's
right.
great.
But the close air support was absolutely the most rewarding. We would have the Army and Marine troops when they came through Cam Ranh Bay, because that was a big MAC terminal for inbound and outbound troops, come look us up. And they just couldn't say enough. And boy, what a wonderful experience to know that you helped your fellow Americans who were down on the ground in foxholes living a really tough existence.
So Tony, you were telling me about the kind of missions you were flying out of Cam Ranh Bay. Did you fly primarily in South Vietnam or North Vietnam or both?
Most of my missions were in South Vietnam. Of the 215 sorties, roughly 25 were north. The rest were in either South Vietnam or Laos. As I indicated, we flew all kinds of missions from the troop support to, I was involved in the Ashaw Valley, which was a big happening where we had a lot of North Vietnamese troops that we were after. We provided protection for ranch hand aircraft, which were the aircraft that were spraying Agent Orange. We would fly a racetrack pattern around them, laying down cannon fire to keep the heads down because they are slow and not very maneuverable aircraft.
Were you being shot at while you were flying these missions?
Yes, we could see tracers, and we would try to keep them down. I always tried to volunteer for one particular flight. It always hit the same road bend in Laos. It was the first night flight, and the reason I did that was because you couldn't get home on this flight. So I called it the dinner flight because I would have to land at Yuban Ratchathani every night. So we'd go to the officers' club, have dinner, get back in the airplane, and fly it home, back to Cam Ranh Bay. So that was a dinner flight. So that kind of thing, we were after the Ho Chi Minh Trail, obviously. We had some of the darndest targets. Elephants were targets on occasions because they were using those for hauling supplies and munitions, and the FAC would find them in the trees, and you'd go after them just as if they were trucks.
Did you ever see an elephant, or were you just shooting where they were?
We were, again, the white phosphorus rocket, and told that there were elephants down there hauling goods, and so we would go after those. We would go after sampans. It was just about everything except. And I don't remember all the specifics, so I'm not going to talk about it, but the rules of engagement. There were certain things off limits, so.
Were you, when you flew these missions, I note that you were awarded 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Can you recall any of those specific missions and tell us a little bit about your being awarded the DFC?
Those missions were all involved troop support. And I don't remember the specifics, and I know you've asked me to get the certificates and the documents, and I will as soon as I can. They're up north at the other house. But the only one that I can really recall, because it scared the daylights out of me, is we had to fly into a mountain that was covered by clouds to drop ordnance to help the troops that were in big trouble. And flying into a mountain and pulling up into the mountain is not one of the brightest things you can do.
Well, you mean flying into a mountain. You mean flying into the vicinity of a mountain, I hope. Not literally flying into the mountain.
Flying at a mountain, yeah.
Okay. Was covered by clouds?
Yes, and the troops were in big trouble there, so.
So you were dropping ordnance close to the troops?
Yes, and that was always a big challenge. I never came closer than the FAC wanted, and you know that oftentimes there's friendly fire and it gets it's dropped in the wrong place. And I got a story to tell you about that here before we finish. But that was a very scary mission because it's multiple passes into towards the mountain, and those mountains were tree covered, and they came right out of the ground from nothing to a mountain.
Well, you must have accomplished your mission if you were awarded a DFC on this particular mission you're talking about.
We did.
Do you remember what kind of ordnance you were dropping?
No.
Okay.
I don't.
Well, you said you had one other story about friendly fire or close.
Yeah. There's a Marine base up near Da Nang called Chu Lai. It was the only place you could hot refuel, meaning you could land with ordnance on the aircraft, taxi up to the fuel pits, with the engines running, they would refuel the aircraft, you could take off, find another forward air controller who would give you a target. So one day, I was on the wing, we went to a target. Now, these targets often had more than one flight holding to drop ordnance on the target. So the forward air controller would put you in a holding pattern at certain altitudes while he marked the target for the flight that was on the target at that time. The flight ahead of us dropped their bombs on the friendlies. He sent everybody home. So the flight lead, our flight, went to Chulai to hot refuel to take off to fly again. When we came into Chulai, I got hit by a single round in the nose gear actuator. I had 2 pods of rockets and 4 cans of napalm on the aircraft. When we landed, the nose gear collapsed, and the aircraft went sliding down the runway on the radome. Well, those napalm cans were inches off the runway. So, although you're not supposed to do this, as the aircraft slowed down, I lowered the hook. Because the problem is if you're going too fast, you catch the hook, then the nose slams down on the runway. We were going slow enough that I made the decision to put the hook down so that the aircraft wouldn't go off the runway. It caught the barrier. We opened the canopies, and we jumped down on the wing and ran across the airfield. So this aircraft is sitting in the middle of the runway, this is a Marine base, with 4 cans of napalm and two pods of rockets. We're across the runway, we're out in the middle of the field, and an aircraft lands on the runway. Well, I don't know how he did it, but he got around our aircraft. Turns out it was the guy that dropped on the friendlies, that the backseater had thought he had the Da Nang TACAN in his TACAN equipment, and in fact had put Chulai in there. So it was mistake after mistake after mistake. They're flashing the donut at him, which means nothing to an Air Force pilot, right? And he lands anyway, and somehow everybody survived this potential accident.
Did they move the aircraft that you landed? Did they get it off without any problems with the napalm cans?
Yeah, they picked it up with a cherry picker, which is a big crane. Moved it back to their maintenance facility, downloaded the missiles, downloaded the ordnance, repaired the nose gear, loaded it up, and we took off 2 days later.
Wow.
In the meantime, we stayed in a Marine tent called Menopause Manor. And those poor Marines, we lived in nice Quonset huts at Cameron Bay. They lived in tents. And I'm glad I wasn't in the Marine Air Corps.
How was the living facilities at Cameron Bay? You said you lived at Quonset huts. Did you have decent meals? And
we had good meals. We had decent quarters, air-conditioned quarters. We had our own hooch, our own bar, so to speak. It was as nice as they could make it. We had a wonderful beach. It was like swimming in a fishbowl down there with all the tropical kind of fish that you saw. And the only time the base ever got hit was one night, and I happened to be flying that night. We had the Republic of Korean troops, the South Korean troops guarding the peninsula, and the Vietnamese didn't mess with them. The Koreans took no prisoners. So it was a very, if you had to be there, it was a very, very safe place to be. The other experience that's worth relating to you is, and this is what the Bronze Star was for, was I forget the exact terminology, but I was the flight test pilot. at Cameron Bay. I chose not to come back from my missions and spend it in the bar. I have a family history of some alcoholic problems, so that can be genetic too. So I spent my time flying test flights. And any aircraft that was battle damaged or had major maintenance had to be test flown before it was released to combat. I had two incidences that were eye-watering in regards to this flying. One was an aircraft was so shot up that you couldn't raise the landing gear or the flaps and needed to be flown in that fashion all the way to Taichung, Taiwan. So I flew that flight with a tanker with the gear and flaps down the entire way.
How long was that flight?
I don't remember. I just remember that the aircraft kind of wallowed around the sky a little bit on that long of a flight. The other one was frankly very scary, and it was as close to an ejection that I had to initiate that I've ever had. Is that when you test fly an aircraft, obviously you retard both throttles one at a time. You shut engines down. You start them up in the air. And I shut an engine down, and then I pulled the other throttle back, or whatever the procedure was. Both engines shut down. Couldn't move the throttles forward. I finally I don't know how I was able to do this, but I got my leg back far enough that I could put it against the throttles here, and pushed and pushed, and finally it broke loose and got it forward, put the ram air turbine out, and got these two engines started. Hollered emergency, came in downwind at Cameron, and it turned out that a mechanic had left a wrench in the throttle box.
Wow.
But we came very close to bailing out of that aircraft in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Sounds like your test flights were almost as scary as your combat missions.
Well, I'm sure you had some of those experiences also.
So let's see. You finished up in Cameron Bay in what year?
I finished up in 68, October of 68, I believe it was.
Okay. Tony, tell me a little bit about the airplane. How fast did it go? What'd you do with it?
Well, originally this was a Navy fleet defense aircraft that the Air Force built numerous versions of. And this aircraft is a two-seater with the aircraft commander in the front seat and the radar operator, or what was originally called a GIB, a guy in the back who was a pilot, flew. It flew Mach 2.3 clean.
What does that mean?
Well, roughly, let's say 1,500 miles an hour.
Yeah, more than twice the speed of sound.
Okay.
And it carries 4 Sparrow missiles, which are radar-guided missiles, as well as Sidewinder missiles, and those were used to shoot down aircraft. This aircraft originally, and probably the weakest point of it originally, was that it did not have a gun. Eventually they put a centerline gun on the C and D models, which was an external pod carried on the belly of the aircraft.
Which model did you fly?
I flew both the C and the D. The D model we had, the first versions of the D model we took to Germany. It was designed to deliver tactical nuclear weapons for that theater. And the C model was the original aircraft for the United States Air Force. They eventually had an E model and a G model. The E model had a gun in the nose because of the need that was determined through combat experience in Vietnam. And the G model was a Wild Weasel model that was an advanced version of the E model to go after radar SAM-2 sites.
What kind of a load did you carry when you were flying the F-4D in Vietnam?
Well, it was we carried 750-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, napalm, rockets, CBUs, which is a cluster bomblet, which is a bomb that opens up and the smaller bombs fall out of it. The gun, and I said rockets, and the missiles.
About what airspeed were you flying when you dropped your bombs and rockets?
It all depended how much anti-aircraft fire.
So roughly what was it?
Could be up to 400 knots. And the dive angle was determined also by how much anti-aircraft fire there was.
So when you dropped dive bombs, you were dropping at what angle usually?
40, 45 degrees.
And what speed would you be?
400 knots.
Yeah.
And dropping at what altitude above the ground usually?
Gee whiz. I don't remember. It was 7,500 feet, 10,000 feet. And if we were really getting shot, that'd be a lot higher.
Okay.
Now, you may not have, but did the F-4s go up north? Did they see any air-to-air combat?
Yes, the F-4 had a lot of MiG kills up north. I saw no MiGs, and I saw no missiles launched at me, but we carried in the cockpit a indicator when the SAM site would lock onto you and would also tell you when they fired a missile. I'm very thankful I didn't see any, but I did see a tremendous amount of anti-aircraft fire, including on the night of Tet, anti-aircraft fire that was very much like what we see in movies of World War II, where they shot curtains up. I believe it was 37, 57, and 85 millimeters. Is that what you recall?
Right.
Yeah.
So, Tet, what year was that, Tony?
That was in 1968, January and February of 1968. And the night of Tet, I was on the alert pad. There were 2 aircraft on the alert pad, and we were scrambled twice that night with cartridge starts, which normally these aircraft are started with air forced into the engine, which turns them over and then you light them off. But with a cartridge start, it's an explosive start, and we immediately scrambled up to Route Package 1 from Cameron Bay, which is a long ride without a tanker, dropped on an island, and came back and changed our shorts.
Route Package 1, you mean what part of Vietnam? Was that North Vietnam?
That's in North Vietnam. The North was divided up with the DMZ, and then Route Package 1 all the way up to Route Package 5, which was Hanoi and Haiphong. I never got further north than Route Package 1, and I only had, of my 215 sorties, 25 roughly into either the DMZ or Route Package 1.
Were the defenses in Route Package 1 more intense than in South Vietnam?
Very much so. That's where they had the heavy anti-aircraft fire and missiles, the SAM sites, along with small arms fire, but it was where they had the big guns.
How many missions did you fly total in Vietnam, Tony?
215 sorties.
Those SAMs that they shot, could you could you tell if they were coming at you? Like you mentioned, the air-to-air, you had something in the cockpit that would tell you.
When they fired the SAM, you would start looking for a SAM missile.
Okay.
And the tactic was to turn into it, because it would over-G and come apart.
But you had no idea that it was, unless you actually saw it. I mean, you didn't have any electronics say, "Oh, there's a SAM coming after me."
Just that it was fired.
Okay. Oh, what?
Just that a SAM had been fired.
Oh, okay. You did know that.
Is my recollection.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And you said you turned into it?
You would turn into it so that it would over-G and come apart.
Oh.
You wouldn't turn away from it because it would
follow you.
It would be right at your 6.
When you say over-G, what does that mean?
Well, it would be too much stress on it as it tried to turn.
That
That you can over-G an aircraft also. There's limits on aircraft as to how many G's you can pull. And then after that, you put too much stress on the aircraft, and all kinds of funny things can happen.
And that worked?
They tell me it worked.
Okay.
Again, I never saw one.
Okay. What's that opening there, by the way?
That's the intake for the engine, the left engine. And one of the interesting things about this aircraft is that as you approach supersonic speed, this would open up or close, come into the intake, so that the shock wave from the supersonic speed would not go into the engine, which would cause it to come apart.
And what does supersonic speed mean?
The speed of sound.
Okay. All right. And let's go back and take a look at the afterburners and tell me about the engines that this plane had.
This aircraft, I always called it a powered rock. It was a very forgiving aircraft, but it didn't have much of a glide ratio, and it had a tremendous amount of power. So you could take off, stand it on its tail, going straight up, and get to 30, 40,000 feet before you had to roll it over. It had so much power.
Tony, the F-4 is a very big airplane. How was it to land? Was it a difficult airplane to land?
No, it was very easy to land. The Air Force version of the F-4 had stick and throttles in the back seat, and the ability through emergency procedures to blow the flaps down and blow the landing gear down. You can land the aircraft, and the guy in the back, when he was a pilot, used to be given the opportunity to land from the back seat.
Is the back seat also where an instructor pilot flew if he was checking you out in the F-4?
That's correct. The Navy version did not have the ability to do that. Now, you asked about landing the aircraft. In Vietnam, this is the tail hook that the Navy used. We used it in Vietnam because during the monsoon season, you would get so much water on the runway that the aircraft would hydroplane. We had a barrier across the runway that you would lower the hook, take the barrier. The barrier had, as I understood it, was B-52 brakes on it. You'd land in the barrier, you'd get off the brakes when you got stopped. The barrier would pull you back. They'd give you the thumbs up, you'd raise the hook and taxi off, and they'd wind it up for the next aircraft.
Wow.
It worked very well, and it kept us out of a lot of trouble because there were aircraft going off the runway because of the tremendous amount of water that would pile up.
What's the power plant here?
These are J79 engines that produce about 18,000 pounds of thrust an engine. This is the afterburner section.
Right.
And
Could you fly on one engine?
yes, you could. That was one of the beauties of this aircraft. It was a centerline thrust, 2 engines, and that made it a little easier than having engines out on the wings with one, trying to fly with one engine.
And
It was obviously a little more difficult.
right? What's the name of the power plant again? Here.
It's a General Electric J79.
Do any of the other planes have that?
I don't know. I know that no other aircraft that you have here have this engine
Okay.
in it.
All right. Yeah.
But I don't know what other.
Aircraft may have.
Yeah.
Okay. Bob, you got anything else before we go back up?
The other unique thing about
Yeah.
this aircraft is this negative dihedral tail. You would not find this slab on any other aircraft that I can think of.
So you're talking about how it slopes down rather than straight across or up.
Exactly.
Yeah, Tony, one other question about the airplane, the speed brakes. Can you tell us about the speed brakes and what their purpose was and how they operated?
Well, the speed brakes operated from a switch in the cockpit, and they're just exactly what that is. They were brakes. They created a tremendous amount of drag. So when you landed, you would put the speed brakes out after you were down, as well as there's a drag chute in the tail. Up on that little gray section underneath the fuel vent, you have a drag chute, and you open the drag chute up. But in combat, in air-to-air combat, you could throw those speed brakes out, the aircraft would come to a stop, and if you had, say, a MiG on your tail, if he wasn't careful, he'd just go flying right by you. You'd raise the brakes and you'd be at his 6 o'clock, meaning behind him.
But they look so small, it doesn't seem like they would have done all that much.
Well, there's a tremendous,
Yeah,
tremendous amount of breakage
that's
there.
great.
Tony,
Yeah.
about roughly what speed did you land at? Did you
Huh?
touch down runway?
As I recall, the formula was 140 knots plus 2 knots for every 1,000 pounds of fuel.
So 140 knots, that's about what in miles per hour? 160?
That's would be my guess also.
Yeah.
And that really is not very fast.
Oh, one other question, Tony. Did you, in the F-4 that you flew, did you in-flight refuel from tankers?
Yes, we did. In Vietnam, we did a lot of in-flight refueling. And behind, we have to go over here, but right behind the rear canopy is a door that opens up. Now, everybody has this mystical idea that refueling is difficult. It isn't. All you do is fly formation on the tanker. The tanker belly has some lights on it that tell you whether you need to move back or forward, but you just fly formation. You hold that formation, and he puts a probe into that door. And there is, obviously the aircraft goes up and down a little bit, but I never had any difficulty. First time obviously was a little bit frightening because you'd never done it before. After that it was nothing. We night refueled, we day refueled. Refueling with Ordnance on board can be a little more difficult because of the tremendous amount of weight and the speeds and the power settings you must carry. Sometimes, depending on the tanker, they could not do that. You had to toboggan, meaning the tanker would go into a slow dive, a shallow dive, excuse me, to keep his airspeed up, and then he'd pull up and you'd just fly formation with the tanker.
What was the tanker that you refueled from usually?
Normally it was a KC-135, although we have refueled this aircraft off of a C-97, KC-97, which was a propeller-driven older version of a tanker.
The KC-135 was a jet like a 707?
Exactly, yes. That's exactly what it was.
Good. Okay.
Okay.
I think
Got enough there?
The
I think
only
so.
other thing-
Yeah. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, why don't you stop for a minute? I've ejected out of this aircraft. Do you want to talk about
Yeah.
that now?
Yeah. Let's do it.
That's good. Move over in the sun where you get a little better sunning.
Yeah. And
We're not gonna have much sun.
That's what I'm talking about.
what were the circumstances of that?
The ejection, the mission that evening, I flew as the instructor pilot in the back seat, and the squadron commander flew in the front seat. It was my 3rd anniversary, wedding anniversary. So I should have been home, not flying. In any event, as a young pilot, we wanted our hours, so we flew.
And this was in the States?
It was in the UK.
Okay.
The mission that night was to qualify the squadron commander for night refueling. So 2 F-4s, we always flew in Flight of 2 out of RAF Bentwaters, which is on the North Sea near Ipswich, took off and met the tanker in northern England. We refueled with no problem at all and had briefed the number 2 aircraft, who was a recently upgraded Gib, meaning he had moved up from the back seat to the front seat, and to fly 5 miles in trail. And that's a very easy thing to do because you lock onto the lead aircraft with your radar and you keep that aircraft at the 5-mile ring on the aircraft. There's rings showing the distances. Well, the next thing we knew was, for some reason, we totally lost control of the aircraft, and the squadron commander in the front seat, who had ejected before, interestingly enough, on his 3rd anniversary, a coincidence, pulled the handle. The backseater the guy in the back seat, which was me, always goes first because these are rocket ejection seats, and that rocket would burn, they say, to death the guy in the back seat. So I went out, and then he went out, and all I saw was a big fireball. Had no idea what had happened, and neither did he. We came down in a very bad rainstorm up near the town of York, which is up near the Scottish border, and landed in a freshly fertilized field full of pig dung on opposite sides of a hedgerow. But I remember coming down, and with my hands, one arm was broken, and I knew that, and the helmet was gone, going like this, am I alive? I can really remember that. So anyway, we landed in this field. We were able to talk to each other across this hedgerow, and eventually I said to him, I see some tractor lights. I'm going to walk over to the lights and get some help.
Excuse me.
On the way over to the
Sorry.
on the way over to the tractor, I came across a house. The house had no lights and no automobile. It turned out to be a tenant farmer's house, and I knocked on the door, and they came to the door, and I was standing at the door when they came in my flight suit, G suit, and the helmet had peeled back, and the oxygen mask, so I was bleeding across the face, and full of pig manure. And they invited me in and said that they had heard the explosion from the aircraft. At that point, in typical British fashion, they asked me if I wanted to drink a scotch, which of course, as a fighter pilot, I took and promptly threw up in their house. They laid me down on their couch, and the husband got on his bicycle in this rainstorm and rode to the village to alert the police of the accident. The police came out, and the RAF informed us that they would come out in the morning and pick us up with a helicopter. The colonel, who was the squadron commander, lay out all night because they couldn't move him. I was inside, and they came the next morning, helicoptered us to an RAF base, and then picked us up in interestingly enough, a C-47, which you have here at the museum, and took us back to our base. And then they took us from there to RAF Lakenheath, where the hospital was, and took care of our wounds, of which were a lot of broken bones. He had broken both his kneecaps, hitting the dashboard on his way out.
Tony, did you ever determine what caused you to go out of control in the aircraft?
Yes, I'll use my hands to illustrate. This was our aircraft. The other aircraft came up underneath us. I don't know how he got there, and hit a wing. We're lucky he didn't hit the fuselage. When he hit our wing cut open the belly of his aircraft, and he continued to fly until he ran out of gas. They ejected over an RAF airbase. One of the ejection seats went through the hangar roof, where the RAF was working on the aircraft in the hangar. So, in essence, all four people lived from two F-4s running together, which in itself is absolutely amazing. Now, they did send our closest friend, who we had been stationed with in Germany and in Vietnam, out to tell my wife we were dead, which was a horrible mistake. And he refused to do it until, which is interesting, until they had confirmed the outcome of this particular event. I will tell you this, that the aircraft landed in a pig farm, and the United States Air Force paid for a lot of piglets that were supposedly stillborn because of the trauma of an F-4 landing in the pig farm.
Where did the other one go down?
The other one ended up in an RAF base.
Oh,
It went down
in the
on
base.
the airfield.
On the airfield.
These guys ejected.